For those of you who don't know me, my name is Caitlin Southwick. I am the founder and executive director at Key Culture and the CEO at Key Futures. So we are a nonprofit and for-profit, and all we do is focus on sustainability and culture. So I am absolutely thrilled to be invited by Europeana to do this workshop series on sustainability. And we are here today in the third part of the series, where we're going to be focusing on digital. So I'm also really excited to be joined by my colleague, Patrick from Europeana, who is going to be co-presenting and co-hosting with me. I do have just a couple of kind of quick overviews about what we're going to be doing today, and then we'll get started. So if you guys are okay with it, I'm going to quickly share my screen and give you a short overview of workshop number 3 on digital climate action. So one of the interesting things about digital when it comes to sustainability is that it's not just environmental. Although even the fact that it does have an environmental impact is quite amazing. I remember the first time that I learned that an email has a carbon footprint. I was absolutely shocked to hear that and embarrassed because I looked at my inbox and there was 20,000 plus emails in there. So I now have a habit of going back through and deleting emails once a month to make sure I can keep that a little bit more manageable. But what we're really going to explore today is this idea of digital impact. We know a lot of the benefits of digital, but we'll explore a little bit more in depth some of these benefits today. And then we're also going to look at what some of the obstacles or some of the questions are surrounding digital, and particularly in relation to carbon footprint and environmental impact and accessibility and social impact. So the structure of our presentation or of our workshop today is going to be basically divided into 2 parts. So we're going to start by giving an overview to everyone. So we'll take an hour where Patrick will present on environment, and then I will do a presentation on social. We'll go through kind of the pros and cons of these different components. And then what we'd like to do in the second half is put you guys in breakout rooms, and we're going to give you little assignments, or actually rather activities that you can do to integrate a little bit more into these ideas of digital environmental impact and social impact. So we will open the breakout rooms for 45 minutes. That should give everyone enough time to engage with the activity and discuss it amongst the participants. And then what we'll do is we'd like to invite you all back for a debrief session where we'll hear from all of the breakout rooms. So just keep in mind, we'll have one person from each breakout room kind of presenting, and have a more general discussion amongst the group. You will be free to choose whichever breakout room you would like to participate in. So we will open up the breakout rooms and let you choose. And of course, if you have any questions or anything, Patrick and I will be coming around to the breakout rooms to help guide you through the processes and answer any questions you have. So without further ado, I will stop sharing my screen, and I would love to turn over to Patrick to kick us off with environmental impact on digital cultural heritage. So Patrick, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Caitlin. Let me see if all is well. You can see my screen now. Yeah, okay, that's great. Yeah, and as Caitlin mentioned, we're not with a very large group, which is nice, so we can have a chat. So if you have, meanwhile, have questions, remarks, just put them in the chat, and I'll keep an eye at it and see if I can address any questions you have. But let's start with, well, very brief, something about me. I'm a software developer working at Europeana. I'm also leading the Europeana's green team, and we try to reduce our environmental impact as much as possible. And now a question to you: what aspect of your usage of digital, personally or at work, do you think has the biggest environmental impact? If you have any ideas about that, please share in the chat. Yeah, I'm curious what you will type there. So what do you think for you has the biggest environmental impact when it comes to your usage of digital, of the internet, of your mobile phone? Zoom, yeah, well, at the moment, certainly. What we are doing right now does have an impact. ChatGPT, I see, indeed, the impact of that is very, very big. Filing online documents, emails certainly also has an impact. Storing our digitized collections could very well be, depends probably also where you store it. Long email threads, web search has an impact indeed. Well, thanks for sharing. These are great answers. And yeah, you see there's all kinds of different things, and there is not really one aspect that is problematic or worse. It's a lot of things that you need to take into account. So for my part, what we'll cover is basically three things. First, the pros and cons of digital. Then what can you do about these cons? And third will be measuring impact. So let's start with the pros and cons. And I'm sure you are quite familiar with a lot of the advantages of digital. Obviously, with digital, you can reach a very wide audience. I think more than half of the world's population is online already, and that number is growing every year. So yeah, you have a very big audience when you put things online. Online is also much easier to access information. It's available 24/7. And it also allows researchers, if you have your collections online, allows researchers to collaborate online, to share their information online, to look at all the collection data that you have. Digital preservation is an important one. Accidents can happen. Yeah, let's hope not. But if you just think back about the war in Ukraine, for example, a lot of cultural heritage was and still is being destroyed there. And if, yeah, if you have digital images, videos, footage, at least there is some record left of this. The same goes for natural disasters. We hope everyone's collection is very safe, but you never know what can happen. And digitizing it will make sure that things will be preserved. Digital can also reduce environmental footprint. It has its own footprint, of course, but yeah, depending on what it replaces, what it substitutes, it can actually be a benefit in terms of sustainability. And I'll come back with some explanations, with some examples later. And yeah, there are two important topics in the cultural sector. Well, maybe three if you also include finance, but sustainability and digital are major topics at the moment. And as a cultural institution, you really need to think about both to stay relevant. It's what people expect. People expect your organization to have a website, to, I don't know, sell online tickets, but they also expect cultural institutions to work with sustainability, to be active in that respect. Yeah, to give an example of how you can use digital to reduce your footprint. The Royal Library in the Netherlands is planning a new book archive, and it's designed to have a low oxygen climate, which is great because that helps preserve the books, make sure the bugs don't survive. Obviously, it's also difficult for people. So the solution there is to use robots to store and retrieve the books. So that's a digital system for managing your collection. Obviously, that has an impact. It requires electricity, but the advantage is there in this setup, there is no climate system required. So that actually saves energy and costs. The net benefit is actually positive compared to the current solution. Then the downsides of digital. Yeah, in my view, one of the biggest downsides, maybe the biggest, is its environmental impacts. Digital, you need hardware for anything, to do anything digital, and you need electricity to send data, to power all the servers, your computers, your modem. And that impact is quite often hidden. I see that also as a big downside, because many people are not aware of the large impact digital can have. And finally, one of the downsides is Jevons paradox, which says that if you make something easier to use, more efficient to use, then people will start using it more. And the increased usage will undo some of your original efficiency gains. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So first, hardware. The environmental impact of hardware comes from you need resources to build a computer server or to build a cell phone. So resource extraction, manufacturing, the transport to stores, all have a very large negative effect. But also the lifespan of digital devices or equipment is fairly short. Just think of all the people who are buying new cell phones every 2 years. It's, yeah, in my opinion, it's a bit ridiculous, but we're forced to do that because things get outdated, they start to become slow, no software support anymore. And also for computer servers, the average lifespan of a server in a data center is 5 to 8 years. Also, hardware is rather expensive to recycle. It's hardly worthwhile, and it's also quite difficult to recycle because it's lots of different materials all glued together in these tiny little components. So the consequence of all that is that worldwide, only about 70% of all the e-waste, that's the term for all your electronic devices and cables and equipment that is thrown away, only 17% is properly recycled. And most e-waste, unfortunately, is still being dumped in countries like Ghana or Rwanda, India, China. And Europe is actually the biggest producer of e-waste. On the positive side, we are also the world leaders in e-waste recycling. I think the official number is somewhere around 42% of all e-waste that is recycled in Europe. But the goal is actually 65%, and it has been since 2019. We still haven't achieved that, so there's quite a bit of work to do there. Yeah, for electricity, all the things that require electricity, obviously you're aware that your phone needs it, your laptop needs it. You may also be aware, but it's already a bit more hidden, that all the data that you send or receive requires electricity. The more data you send, the more electricity you use. Obviously, also your peripherals, modem, routers, cables, cell phone towers, but also there are a lot of data centers in the world which require huge amounts of electricity because of all the servers that are running there 24/7 and all the cooling that is required. Oh, that's a bit too far. Yeah. And why is electricity a problem? Well, worldwide, about 29% of all electricity comes from renewable resources. So even if you at home have solar panels and are doing great in terms of sustainability, a lot of the digital infrastructure that you're using will be powered with coal or natural gas. And given that the internet is already using like 10% of all the electricity generated worldwide, so the result is that 2 to 4% of all the global carbon emissions is coming from internet, from ICT usage. And already mentioned briefly the Jevons paradox. The efficiency gain of a new technology is reduced because it becomes popular and people start using it more and more. And yeah, just a good example here is think back about the world before internet. It's for the people who are a bit older, maybe. Before 1990, people would write letters to each other, send them by snail mail, as we call it now. And now we're sending around emails, and it's literally thousands of emails are sent out, millions of emails are sent out every day. People receive hundreds of emails per day easily. So that's quite a difference, quite an increase in usage compared to the paper letters of 30, 40 years ago. And the expectations are that the increase of ICT, of internet, will continue, and that we will be using like 20% of all the electricity in 2014, and global emissions will rise accordingly. Yeah, that's net usage from sending email, but you also have stored data, and you see a similar trend there, or maybe even a worse trend. Here's a graph that shows the amount of data that is being stored up until 2020, and the rest is, well, projections, forecasts. And that's in 2020, that was the last number that was not projected in this graph. There was 64.2 zettabytes of data estimated being stored. And that is a staggering number, because a zettabyte is a 1 and then 21 zeros. In terms of gigabytes, that's a term you're more familiar with. And sorry, if to put that a bit into perspective, if you would store that kind of data on a 20 terabyte hard disk, which is about the largest hard drives you can buy at the moment, and you would put all those disks in one line, you could wrap the Earth like 8,000 times, or go to the moon and back 400 times. So that's really, really a lot. Right, so what can we do about this? Yeah, for the hardware, there are no ideal solutions when it comes to hardware. The good news is that hardware manufacturing, no, sorry, I should phrase it different. Hardware reuse, repair is starting to become popular now. But the manufacturing and the disposal of hardware so far has seen little progress. But yeah, to state a few of the great initiatives for mobile phones, for example, you have an initiative called Fairphone, a company that is selling modular cell phones. Those cell phones are repairable. You can repair them yourself. And the company also guarantees like a 5-year lifespan of software support, availability of replacement parts. And they also try to use as much ethically sourced metals as possible. A lot of hardware contains metals, and it comes from mostly from mines in developing countries where working conditions aren't great, child labor, things like that. So it's great to see a company like Fairphone trying their best here. And there's also for laptops, there's a similar initiative recently, which is called the Framework laptop, also designed with repair and upgrades in mind. And yeah, as I mentioned, repairability is starting to become a hot topic. I'm glad about that. There's EU legislation now in the making that will require manufacturers to offer support and spare parts for electronics for 5 to 10 years. So at the moment, this is 2 years. So that's already quite an improvement, but it's legislation in the making. It's not there yet. Meanwhile, we do have initiatives like iFixit that give you detailed step-by-step instructions how to repair all different kinds of electronic devices online. For computer servers in data centers, there are no great solutions yet. Manufacturing still has an impact. E-waste is still problematic. One of the future solutions that I'm hoping will make an improvement is water-soluble circuit boards, but it's still in the research phase. Researchers are working on this. And the idea is here that you, instead of like some silicium board with all the components, you have something that is water-soluble. So if you eventually want to dispose of the hardware, you just dissolve it in water and all the metals are left and can be reused. So yeah, for now, this water-soluble solutions are not there yet. So at the best we can do in terms of hardware at the moment is just use devices as long as possible. Repair is always the best option. When things become slow, when your computer starts dragging, taking ages to start up, you can try to upgrade it. You can try to maybe use a more slimmer open source operating system that will also help. In my experience, the open source Linux-based systems are much better there than, for example, the proprietary Apple or Windows. But yeah, sometimes devices are just not repairable anymore, upgradable, no options anymore. So then when you have to buy something new, make sure that you look at something that is repairable, has low energy consumption, and that the manufacturer does supply for a long time software updates and spare parts. Or you may also want to consider refurbished or manufactured devices where manufacturers have reused old parts or upgraded an old model to become to be up to the latest standards. And when you do eventually have to dispose of your old device, make sure that it is recycled properly. So what can you do in terms of electricity usage? Well, obviously, switch to renewable electricity if you haven't done so already, or switch to a internet hosting provider or digital service provider that is using renewable energy. But energy saving can also help. And there's basically two ways to do that. You can try and reduce all the data that you're storing, especially the data in the cloud. And that is because, well, data on your local hard disk doesn't have that much impact. As long as you can add more data, you're fine. There's no need to add another hard disk to invest in new hardware. But in the cloud, all the data stored there have to be available 24/7. So it requires servers to be available all the time. And what most people are not aware of, when you store something in the cloud, usually that means that 3 to 5 copies are being made behind the scenes automatically. And that is because companies like Apple and Google that store your data want to make sure it's not lost. So if a hard disk fails, it will be automatically the job will be automatically taken over by another hard disk that is running on the side with a copy of the data. So that makes data storage in the cloud much more impactful, much higher footprint than data that you store on your own hard disk. So yeah, what you can do about it is to have data cleanups. In Europeana, we introduced a monthly digital cleanup hour where we check if there is data that we don't need anymore. So that's something you can do. And another way to try and reduce electricity usage is by reducing the amount of data that you send and receive. Already mentioned, the more data you send or receive, the more electricity is being used. So if you can make sure that everything that you send, that you put online is used efficiently, that can also, to make it lean, so to speak, that can also make a difference. And here, there's also something called digital sobriety. And basically that says to be mindful, to think about what you're putting online and what impact that has. And to give an example, yeah, people already mentioned this Zoom session, of course, has a digital impact. Like all online meeting software, it has an impact. And turning your camera off, because video has a rather high impact, turning your camera off can lead up to, it's not necessarily 96% CO2 reduction, but can lead up to 96% reduction of your CO2 emissions. I see a question in the chat. What about the energy consumed by the cloud storage? Yeah, if you store things in the cloud, it will definitely have an impact. How much exactly depends on where it's stored. Quite a lot of organizations are like Google or Microsoft are trying to limit their footprint as much as possible, but they're doing it mostly by offsetting. Oh, sorry, let me go back to that one. So at the moment, it's still best to see if you can limit the amount of storage in the cloud. And also, yeah, as I was mentioning, but just by turning off your camera during this meet, and I certainly don't mind if you turn it off, would be great if to turn it back on when we get to the workshop part, so the other participants see each other. But well, with me speaking, it's just fine for me to turn it off. If you're in a meeting with a small group, things are probably different and you want to turn it on, but then you also have the option, for example, in Zoom to switch off the HD high definition option, which will reduce the amount of data that you're sending. There's a similar options are there in Google Meet, where you can set the sort of the bandwidth of the amount of data that you're sending and receiving. And the last time I checked for Microsoft Teams, it's unfortunately not possible. I think either you switch it on or off, but there's no other settings there. Yeah, so consider when you want to how to participate in online meetings is already an example of digital sobriety, or yeah, personally, I like the term digital mindfulness a bit better. And as I mentioned, video is responsible for quite a lot of data that is being sent to all around the internet. And that is because video, the formatting, the size of everything that you need to send is just quite large. And to give an example, a 2-minute movie, it depends a lot on all kinds of settings, on how big in size the movie is. But let's say it's about 200 megabytes in size. That's a reasonable amount. If you could achieve the same effect just by showing people 3 images, it would only be 6 megabytes. So that's already quite a bit of reduction. But image also has quite an impact compared to words, for example. If you were able to send across the same message in 1,000 words, that is only will take you about 0.002 megabytes in terms of data that needs to be sent to someone else. So the key message here is think about the format that you're using to convey your message. Is the environmental impact that you're causing really worth the message? Sorry. What I'm trying to say is it really worth sending this much data to other people, or could you do it very reasonably with a different way and a smaller environmental impact? So there may be very good reasons to put that 2-minute movie on your website, because I don't know, it's the best way for your purposes, for your audience. But even if you do it, you can optimize things. The example here shows that especially a video has a large impact. Second comes images, and both can be optimized. There are all kinds of tools there. The examples are online tools like Squish.app or Cesium.app that can very easily compress images in this case. There's also online tools for video to compress that. And also to give an example, I don't use that many images in my presentation, but the ones that I do use, I compressed, and I found that reduced the amount of data in my presentation for all the images. It's like 18% smaller than it was if I wouldn't have compressed it. So when you're digital mindful, you start thinking about the impact of all the things that have an impact on the things that you do. There's actually a lot of things that you do, and well, here's a very large list. It's by no means complete. There's lots of other stuff that you can think about, and I won't go into detail here, but yeah, the key message is just think about what it is that you're doing, what impact comes with that, and how you can reduce it. And quite often there are simple solutions to reduce your current impact. But how do you know if you're actually making a difference? So yeah, that's where measuring impact comes in, which is the third part. Yeah, many people will be measuring impacts already, financial impact, your audience satisfaction, your impact on society. Maybe people are aware of the Europeana impact playbook that can also help here, but not much organizations. It's growing fortunately, but my view still not enough organizations are looking at their environmental impact especially when it comes to digital. In previous workshop, Caitlin already mentioned about life cycle analysis. So really from production to usage to disposal, and you can look at a carbon footprint, but most of the time life cycle analysis looks not only at carbon footprint, but also at how much resources were used, water usage, what does it mean in terms of toxicity for the environment. But that kind of analysis is rather costly, rather expensive. So yeah, it would be great if your organization is up to it, but yeah, I can imagine that's a step too far. But carbon footprint is something that is much easier to do. Very briefly, because I think it's also covered in the first workshop. When you look at carbon footprint, there are, people talk about three kinds of scopes. The direct emissions that come from any, I don't know, for example, vehicles that you own that cause direct emissions. Your purchased energy, that's scope 2. Electricity comes with emissions. And then you have scope 3, which is really the bulk of all emissions. And sadly, that part, for most people, the digital isn't there unless your organization has its own a data center. Then it would be using electricity, and that would fall under scope 2. But for most people, digital is something that is bought in, so it's scope 3, and that's also the scope that not many organizations cover, unfortunately. So what is a carbon footprint? Well, if we focus primarily on the usage, because there's at the moment still not much you can do about production and disposal, the impacts of that. So if you focus on usage, carbon footprint would be to look at your energy consumption, how much electricity are you using, and then multiplying by a carbon density factor. And the carbon density factor says, okay, if I have 1 generated kilowatt hour, how much carbon is released to produce that? So to do a carbon footprint calculations, you basically, it's just those two numbers: electricity consumption, carbon density factor. The hard part is actually getting the exact numbers that you need to multiply. For example, if you live, what is shown here is the electricity map of Europe and the carbon density factors of, in real time, of generated electricity. So you can see that the color green is better than the color brown. You can see that Scandinavia, France, for example, the electricity generated there has much less carbon emissions than electricity generated in Poland, for example. But this is a minute by minute figure. It can change when the sun stops shining, when the wind starts blowing. So what people usually use is the average carbon density in a particular country. And here, for example, the carbon density in Germany is around 270 grams. So if you have such a number and you know roughly how much electricity you're using, well, you have a carbon footprint calculation. We did something like this at Europeana, and here I'm just a quick overview of what we calculated. We compared the carbon footprint of our digital services with that of working from home or in the office. It was in 2020, it was during COVID. So, and we also compared it to business travel, which was not much at the time. It's probably increased a bit again. But yeah, I think it's still less than before COVID, so that's positive. And to get that digital services carbon footprint number, what we basically did is we counted the number of rented servers. We didn't have the exact amount of electricity used because all the servers we rent and our providers could not give the exact electricity consumption. So what we did is we counted the number of servers that we rented. There were also several other types of servers that we were using. So we had to estimate how much that was. That is, if you use an online service like Google Drive, for example, you need to estimate, you don't know how much servers are used, so you need to estimate that. Then we estimated the energy consumption per server, but also looked if we could find evidence if that particular server was using renewable energy or not. If it was using renewable energy, we put the carbon density factor to 0. If it was using gray, normal electricity, we would use that country's carbon density factor. So that was some work to get all that the data. And when you want to do this yourself, I really advise you to have a few technical people involved who know the infrastructure of all the technical services that you're offering. That's something that you really need. But fortunately, organizations like Google and Microsoft are starting to supply sustainability numbers if you rent servers from them. For other platforms, they are not there yet. As far as I know, it's at the moment only Google and Microsoft. And I'm not sure how, well, let's say how reliable they are. I can imagine that they use lower number rather than upper level numbers, just to keep the emissions, the final results a bit down. But alternatively, there is also open source data, and that supports also, I think, a few other service providers, and that's the Cloud Carbon Footprint platform, and that you can use for a few of the larger service providers if you rent service, and you can install that. It's open source, it's free, and you can create overviews like this. So yeah, the key message here is that carbon footprint calculations themselves are not very hard, but the hard part is gathering data, and you need people with infrastructure knowledge to help you out if you want to do that. But if you start doing that, don't worry about all your calculations being perfect. It's already great if you have something that you can use as your own benchmark, just to see if the steps that you're taking are having an effect. And yeah, that's what I wanted to share with you for now. And I'll give the floor back to Caitlin.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Patrick. I think that this is such an important topic to learn about, because indeed there are so many, as you pointed out, so many things that we can do to reduce our carbon footprint and our environmental impact digitally. I mean, as I said, when I first found out about digital carbon or environmental impact, I just started, spending my trains deleting old emails. And so it's really interesting to hear about that. We had a quick, I know we're running a little behind schedule, but this is your guys' time. So I do want to make sure we get a chance to answer questions. So we had a question in the chat, and in your experience, are local servers better or worse than cloud abroad servers in terms of energy consumption?
That's a very good question. As usual, it depends a bit. If you are really a large organization, you maybe can afford to make certain optimizations to make your local data center efficient. But I think for most organizations, in terms of efficiency, you can't match the really large data centers. Those are designed to be very efficient. They are working on that every day. So in that respect, I think that the cloud server farms are more efficient than setting up your own servers. There are a few exceptions, but yeah, on average.
That's a great point. Good question. Wonderful. Are there any other questions before we move on to the social impact side of things? No? Okay. Absolutely. Thank you, Ava. Wonderful. All right. Well, we will, of course, have some opportunity to chat further about these things in the breakout sessions. So I would love to thank Patrick once again for his excellent presentation. I am going to scoot through this presentation on social sustainability quite quickly because I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time for the breakout rooms. So I will share my screen without further ado. Here we are. All right. And we're going to go focus mostly on the solutions here because a lot of what we are talking about in terms of pros and cons for social impact are things we're very well aware of. So in terms of social sustainability, and if you joined us in the first workshop, we talked a little bit about what that looks like, everything from diversity, equity, accessibility, inclusion, or rather belonging, which is something I prefer to use. Obviously, digital has a huge impact on this, both in a positive way, but also potentially in a negative way. And so some of the questions we might be thinking about in terms of digital social impact would be, why do we digitize? And this can kind of start planting seeds about what these impacts could be from a social perspective. If we're looking at accessibility, we digitize because we're providing people with access to these collections. And Patrick pointed this out, although it's interesting that he said, there's over 50% of the population that has access to digital. So that's something we'll circle back to in terms of who we're serving with digital access. But the idea behind this, of course, is that we're providing people with access. Additionally, we're providing information. So not just an experience or a collection or an object or an item, but also this information is supposed to be available to everyone everywhere who can access the internet. Obviously, as we already mentioned, there's the added benefits of conservation or documentation for objects that are at risk or to see how objects may change over time. Having this digital record is really important from a conservation perspective. And then, of course, as Patrick mentioned, digital's cool. It's a hot thing to do right now. And of course, during COVID, we all rushed to digitize all of our collections. And a lot of times it feels like this is a way that we can stay relevant. If we're online, if we have a digital presence, then that's a way that we can connect with people. So what we would need to think about here, though, is, not just about why we digitize, but what are we digitizing? As Patrick pointed out, every time we digitize something, it has a carbon footprint. It consumes energy. So do we digitize everything? If you're at an institution that has a collection of 3 million objects, does every single one of those objects need to be online? How do you go about selecting things if you decide you're just going to do a percentage or a certain number of objects? And of course, who gets to decide that? And of course, and then the other question is not just what are we digitizing, but like for whom? Why are we digitizing these things? Who gets access to these things and why? And who might be excluded? So this is what we're going to explore over the next few minutes here. So we talked a little bit about, what we're digitizing. And of course, then the answer here, a lot of times, is that we're not going to digitize everything in our collection. So then who gets to decide what's digitized? If things are open access versus behind a paywall, what is it that we're deciding that people have access to? Also, of course, are we making those decisions ourselves? Or are we making those decisions in collaboration with our audiences or our communities? What are we telling people about these collections? Is this just from our side? Whose narratives are being told and who's writing the content? Is that someone from our collection, or from our institution, or is that someone from the community where the object originally came from? So this is also a huge impact on what information is going out there. It's not just what's being presented at our institutions anymore, but it's also what's online. And if we're the ones who are making this choice, then what are we making that choice based on? Is it our values and our relevance? Like if I'm a collections manager and I'm deciding what objects are going on there, how am I deciding? Is it, oh, I think this is the most important object based on these criteria. Are those my criteria? Are those criteria the same for the audience or for our communities who are going to be receiving this information? And this all really boils down to this idea that there's a lack of co-creation. If what we're digitizing, if what we're putting online is very one-sided, then actually, are we being relevant? So once again, who is this for? When we think about digitizing, do we have a target audience? Is it for museum professionals or cultural professionals? Is it for the audiences that are not coming into our organizations? Also, we have to think about nuances, like what languages are these presented in? If we're really targeting having a global impact with our digital, then is it enough to just put it in English or just put it in a local language plus English? So how many languages does this information need to be converted to? Also, some really interesting things that I never thought about when it comes to accessibility is it's not just about the audiences or who we're making this for, but also people with disabilities. So for people who have low or no vision, how are they able to consume our digital collections? Obviously, the other question is, who has access to this? Is it open source? Is it behind a paywall? Is it for members only? Are we actually being exclusive by being digital? And then for people who don't have access, as I mentioned already, and Patrick talked about the fact that over 50% of people have access to the internet. What about the other 49%? And of course, there's also people who have access to the internet that don't feel comfortable using it. So a lack of digital skills may inhibit people from accessing the information. Even if they can go online, they might not know where to look or how to find the information that we're trying to get to them. So there's a lot of nuances here when it comes to accessibility. The idea behind digitizing is for preservation purposes, but also for accessibility purposes. But there's a lot more to it than just putting things online. So how do we tackle this in a way that we are being considerate, mindful, and socially sustainable? Well, one of the ways that we can do this is thinking about this accessibility, not just by defining it of who has access, but also how can we broaden the audience that has access? So there are a lot of really great tools and resources available. For example, people who have blind or low vision, there are ways to make these to make digital assets available, such as using alternative text, which is more or less a description of a photo, for example, which can be then read by screen readers. For people who have low or no vision, screen readers are an amazing tool to actually be able to interact with digital content. And if you're using alt text in your website or on your social media, then the screen reader will be able to describe images to your consumer, to your audience. So once again, there are these tools available, but we need to make sure that we're doing our part so that these tools can access the information we're trying to convert. So by adding alternative text or alt text to images, we enable people with low or no vision to be able to use their screen readers to access our information. Additionally, we can start thinking about language, and this is something that we can explore a little further in one of our breakout rooms. When we're looking at language, there's not just what language we're using in terms of English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, but also what type of language we're using. What is our tone? How difficult or complicated is it to understand the language? It is typically recommended that text should be at a reading level for the ages of between 11 and 14 in order for it to be considered accessible. And there's this really great ranking tool called the Flesch-Kincaid grade level, which can determine basically what the reading level is, or readability of the text. So one of the workshops we're going to be in just a minute, we're going to be diving into this a little bit further. But this is a really great way for us to assess whether our language is accessible or not, because a lot of our audience will probably not be native speakers of the language we're using. And in order to, of course, not only be accessible to people with different language backgrounds, but also people with different educational levels and cultural backgrounds, it's really important for us to get out of this idea that in order to be professional or in order to seem like we know what we're talking about, we have to use big fancy words. I'm just going to tell you a little story here and then I'll move on to the next topic. But I find this to be incredibly important. I do a lot of speaking engagements, and most of my audience members are not native English speakers. I was speaking at the Austrian Museum Association's annual conference a couple years ago, and I was the only speaker that was not speaking in German. And I was the keynote speaker, first presentation of the day, and I got up and gave my presentation. And at the end of the day, a woman came up to me, and she was retired. She was in her late 60s. And she, for some reason, she spoke Dutch. And so we spoke Dutch together. But she told me, she said, I was really angry when I saw that you were giving the keynote speech and you were doing it in English, because I don't think that's fair for a German speaking audience. And she said, but I have to tell you that I not only found your talk really interesting and engaging, but I found it very accessible. I understood everything that you said. I felt that you used language that was simple and easy for me to understand. And I just wanted to acknowledge that. And that for me, like, that was the most rewarding thing I could have heard, because, you know, what we're actually trying to do is communicate to people. It's not about sounding fancy or about, you know, being academic in these contexts. What we're actually trying to do is help people feel comfortable and excited about the information we're trying to make accessible to them. So I really highly encourage us, especially as very well-educated cultural professionals, to take a step back and think about what our word choices are and how we can use words that are easier for people to understand, no matter what their background is or what their native language is. All right. One of the tips that is recommended is when you are thinking about what word choices to use, speak it out loud. If you've written something down, say it out loud and think to yourself, is this a way that I would talk? Is this something that I would say out loud? Or am I writing this in a non-accessible way? Because usually when we're talking, we tend to use more colloquial or everyday language. Sometimes when we're writing, we have academic tendencies and the language is not as accessible. This is a great website, Monzo. It talks about tone of voice as well as word choice. And just some examples, you know, if you are using the word assistance, maybe you can replace that with the word help. If you're using the word further, maybe you can replace that with the word more. So how can we simplify the words that we're using to make them more accessible? In addition to language, we already talked a little bit about visual representation in terms of using alt text and screen readers. There is the European accessibility guidelines, which from the European Accessibility Act. And there are some really great tools that can help you to determine whether your online presence, your website, for example, or social media are compliant with these guidelines. There's links here to 2 different tools called Wave or Lighthouse. As always, I will make this presentation available, and there's a bunch of resources at the end as well. But it's funny because, you know, it's not just about the text and the images that we're using, but there are things that at least I had never thought of, such as color contrast or the way that you position pictures and text. Also, you know, you see advertisements with like flashing banners, and that can trigger seizures. So these visual elements, as well as the content, are really important for accessibility purposes. And just a couple examples of that, when I'm talking about color contrast, these are some examples. You know, this white on the yellow, for someone that has low vision, that is not easy to read. Also on the right here, we have different examples of contrast being too low. So the contrast is, the text color versus the background color. And if that's not a high contrast, then it can make it difficult to read. So there is, once again, a great tool for checking those things. So you can put your colors in and it will tell you whether the contrast is good enough to be considered accessible. Same thing with image and text. A lot of times, especially from a design perspective, we like to put text into images or over images. This is a super, super basic example of this, but of course, on the left, we have an image that is overlapped with text, and the text is really hard to read. But if you put the text with a background, it makes it much easier to read. Does it take away from the design? I'll let the designers be the ones to judge that, but it makes it much more accessible for people. All right, I see that we have a, oh, thanks, Ava, nice to see you. All right. So I talked a little bit earlier about the lack of co-creation. So I wanted to talk about how we can actually look at being more co-creative. And a lot of this is basically asking people what is interesting and relevant for them, listening and taking that in consideration. Easy enough. Get to know your audiences. Start thinking about who we are making these digital assets for, and how can we make sure that we're being accessible and relevant to them? So depending on what your ideas are, you may need to reach out to new groups. For example, if you think we would like to make sure that this is accessible for people with low vision or no vision, then you might reach out to a group that works with individuals with low or no vision and ask for their input and say, does this make sense? Is this accessible? Do you feel included in this platform? Conversely, you might reach out to somebody, to a group with different language background or community that doesn't normally come into the museum and say, how can we make our digital platforms relevant and interesting for you? So once again, this is about getting to know people. This is about seeing what matters to them. It's not about what matters to us. It's not us selecting, okay, these are the 5 objects that we're going to digitize because we think that they're the most valuable. It's bringing people in to help us put things online that are actually going to be relevant and useful for others. And once again, it's also really important to notice that relevant is not just about being online, because of course, being digital is hot and cool right now, but that's not the only way for us to be relevant. The content is what matters. And then, as I mentioned, this idea of content co-creation or content creation and user-generated content. During COVID, as I mentioned, we all started digitizing everything. And I found this really fascinating. I was talking with Frances Morris, the director of Tate Modern, and she was saying that after, they also rushed to digitize things, and there were virtual tours and all of this digital content available. And she said that there was not an increase by any means in access to digital collections during COVID. And actually what everyone was going to was the interactive kids activities that they put online, because of course parents needed a way to get their kids entertained while they were working during the day. And that was something that was actually user-generated content, because the kids were given activities of creating art and then posting their art online. So that was the most impactful digital asset that Tate Modern created. It had nothing to do with their collections, because their audience needed a certain aspect filled. So this is how we start thinking in a more accessible way. This is how we start thinking about social impact and social sustainability when it comes to digital. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about here is the skill sets. And I already mentioned this before, that accessibility to digital is not just about having an internet connection, but it's about feeling comfortable using that. And it's about feeling comfortable navigating your collections online or your content online. And if people don't feel comfortable doing that, they're not going to do it. So a great way for us to be able to make our digital content more accessible is to offer training and courses on how to use these platforms. So as I said, it's one thing if you're not connected to the internet. It's another thing if you're connected to the internet but don't feel comfortable using it. So this idea of actually providing the training or the skill development for your staff members, but also for your audiences, is really a beneficial way to add elements of social sustainability to your digital performance. And of course, it's also about, providing not only the soft skills or the ability, but also providing the platforms. So for example, having computers at the museum that can be open to visitors to use to access your collections is a great way that you can provide more compatibility with social impact. All right. So I also have created a couple of assignments for our breakout rooms. Just a reminder that after this, we'll take a quick break. We're a little bit over time. Sorry, there's my dog again. We're a little bit over time, but we'll have a short break and then we'll start with the breakout rooms. You'll be able to choose your breakout rooms. So as Patrick already mentioned, he provided 2 really great exercises. The first one on data storage. So this is about, trying to find your largest environmental impact, especially in terms of like your email content in your newsletters. Topic number 2 is looking at the environmental impact of websites. So this is a way that you can actually start looking at how much carbon websites produce and maybe thinking about where that comes from and how to reduce that. And then from the social side, I have also presented 2 exercises. And the first one is looking at accessibility. So this is going back to that idea of getting to know your audience and thinking about the relevance. And thinking about, what information we're sharing. So I would like to encourage our participants in breakout room number 3 to pick a website and then start thinking about who this is accessible to. And in a broad sense, so starting with, who is this written by? What information is being conveyed and from whose perspective? Also, who is this written for? Do we have a target audience? Is this information specifically for a certain type of individual, or is this really written for everybody? What perspectives might be missing from the information that's being presented? And then who's using this? So actually thinking not just about who the target audience is, but actually practically who's accessing this information. And who might not be using this? Who may be the target audience that is not accessing this information? And then, of course, what desirable audiences are missing? So who do we want to see using this that may not be using this? And then also looking at the tools in terms of accessibility. Is the website offered in multiple languages? Do you know if there's alt text? Is there any way to tell if there's alt text? Do you see anything that might be off in terms of color contrasts? So starting to think about the impact from an audience perspective, but also the impact from the accessibility perspective. The next breakout room, the final breakout room that I would like to present is looking at language. So I talked a little bit earlier about readability. I will show you in just a moment the readability analyzer, and I will give you the link for that in the chat. Which is right there. And what I'd like to ask our colleagues to do in this breakout room is to log into the readability analyzer, pick a website, for example, Europeana might be a great website to choose, and then select some text, read it out loud, discuss how it sounds. Does it feel accessible? Are there words in there that you don't know? Because that's perfectly fine. And then plug it into the readability analyzer. Look and see what the score is in terms, it's called a FLESH score. So that's basically its readability or accessibility in terms of word choice and language. And your goal is going to be to get a score of 60 plus. So if it's under 60, which words might not be accessible? And then what words might you be able to replace that with? And I'd like to invite you as a group to play around with the text until you get something that is considered accessible. And once again, I will be coming into the breakout rooms to help guide you through these processes. So don't worry if this sounds a little bit confusing. We'll be doing this together. All right. Welcome back, everyone. Nice to see you all. Let's see. I think everybody, we've had a couple people that got cut off. So looks like we're back. Wonderful. How was everyone's breakout session? Good, interesting, wonderful. Well, I would love to hear how things went. So maybe we can start with breakout 2.
Thank you very much. Apologies, I just have to run, but I'll be brief. So I'm very happy to report back from my group on the assignment number 2 on websites. So what we did was to use 2 different tools, website carbon.com and digitalbeacon.co, and compare how these 2 tools work. So we were actually a bit naughty because we chose a website for ICT for Sustainability Conference in France, and also the UN climate change webpage. So we wanted to know how clean they both are. The results were that both web pages are cleaner than most of the pages tested. So I think they've been doing their homework, but we found a considerable difference in the results while using the 2 tools. So actually the question was, what do you think causes the differences? And after some discussion, we concluded that it's simply very difficult to measure. So it's difficult to be precise, and also different tools measure different different aspects, and it could also be a question of browser download, so first visit against cache or returning visit. Then the question was, how could content creators lower a website environmental impact? And our answer is, first of all, and this was also suggested in another workshop with you, Patrick, is, for instance, to give an option for images to show off a show off button, so that images can have a lower or higher level of detail. Also go for smaller images, reduce the number of apps that people are not using, so measuring which features users are using the most and which are not. Also be sober with the use of video, images, and audio, and also time optimization. So for instance, some apps can be run only at a time when electricity is cheaper. This was an idea. So I think that's it, unless my colleagues want to chip in. I see Justina. Do you want to add something, Justina and Brent?
Yes, it was very, very interesting to explore 2 websites. Also, we have the website of my work, and it's not the good opinion that we have. The good results that we have from the websites, but what I really want to emphasize is that we have to make them as a benchmark, as Patrick says, because we have to maybe to return time after time and to see where the points stands, and to make any other steps in the sustainability directions. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Brent, for the results of the group.
Yeah.
Thank
you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Great. Excellent analysis. Indeed, the differences doesn't matter that much if you continue to use the same tool. You can see if you're making progress. Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And yeah, really exciting to hear the impact, not only in terms of the environmental impact, but the learning impact for us. So that's fantastic. Wonderful. So maybe we can circle back to breakout room number 1 now. Thank you, Lorena. Appreciate it. Anyone from breakout room number 1? Thanks, Laura. So great to see you.
Yes.
Yeah, Lindita.
Yeah. I was with the colleague from France, and Patrick, and we are about data. So data sharing, how can we reduce our footprints from data sharing, from big emails, or as I remembered very well. But we discussed about the reduce of the, I don't know, Patrick maybe can explain it a little bit more.
I think we had quite a bit of interesting discussions, but we tried to focus on emails. But I got the impression that actually both the people in the room were already taking some measures to make sure that their email was not piling up, which is great. So in that respect, I think both participants are doing already quite a good job.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, it's okay. That's what I wanted to say. But it was about reducing emails, big emails. I just said for myself, I said I use sharing the link of the webs or the link of the newsletters. So I get only the link and I gather people so to give the message and the point of the idea of the email. So I don't do group emails and large emails. So or to share videos. I do online meetings, and I give the idea of the newsletter or some big emails that I can share it by talking. So face-to-face meetings.
Nice.
I think one, a way to go further is like always in these topics to first have a view, to measure. As an example, see the biggest emails we have in our inboxes and see, oh my God, this is too much. I have to clean, and after that we can build actions and proceed easier when we have this first step before.
Brilliant. Absolutely.
And I delete emails that are not relevant for my interest, and I delete it even from the trash email. So I don't get some very confusing emails or memory usage of my email. So
Right.
thank you very much. That was the idea. I think we got something in that discussion. Thank you. That was from group 1.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And it's, yeah, really inspiring to hear that this is something that people are aware of. And I know that we started having policies at Key Culture about sharing documents. So instead of sharing PDFs or attachments, we only share links. And then also, and so like everything's on Google Docs and you just share the link. So that's reduced.
As I said in the group, we were doing the website of the school because I'm a teacher. Okay. And in that website, we managed not to open it by HTML. So with the code, we opened it based in another server. So in WebEx that is online. So we managed not to have too much hardware memories, but only online memories. And we managed to select the books from the library, to scan them to make possible a digitized library for the school. And all the activities of the school from 1983 until now. So we have gathered all the information and made a digital museum for the school.
Wow, that's incredible. Wow, thank you for sharing that. I do realize we're over time, so I think we'll very quickly share from breakout room 4 and then we'll close the session. So I'm not going to put anyone on the spot. I'll just do a very quick wrap up and then would love to hear from Ioana or Christina. we worked on language accessibility, and using the tool that I've shared in the chat, we actually analyzed some of the text from the Europeana website. So for example, there's a text on migration that says that humans have always moved from one place to another. Discover the stories of famous migrants and the journeys and lives of ordinary people to, from, and within Europe. And we had a really good time dissecting that and figuring out what parts of that sentence were inaccessible or confusing. And then using the tool, we were able to rewrite the paragraph to a much more accessible level by replacing words or restructuring the framework. So I felt that our group had a really fun time learning about this, but I would love to open up to hear from Ioana or from Christina, if you guys would like to share anything about your experience.
Can everybody hear me properly?
Yes, thank you.
So it was such an amazing experience. I learned a lot. I didn't know about the data analyzer, and it was quite a surprise. So from now on, I'll definitely use it and pay attention much more on how I'm expressing myself.
I love that. Thank you so much. That means a lot. Christina, if you'd like to share maybe.
Yes, I think it was very interesting, and the analyzer helped us a lot, because it is important to achieve a balance between the academic speech and a more accessible speech, because language should not, the text should not be too simple. It should transmit. So reaching this balance is very important, and in this sense, the analyzer helped us a lot.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you so much for joining. All right. Well, we're a few minutes over, so I would like to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you all so much for joining today. This was a really fun experience for me. I hope you all feel like you got a lot out of it. It sounds like it was that was the case. So a huge thank you also to Patrick for being my co-host, and a huge thank you to Europeana for hosting us today. This was a huge pleasure. So if you need anything, please feel free to reach out. You can contact me. I will leave my email in the chat. But otherwise, thank you again for joining us today, and looking forward to continued conversations and collaborations. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening, afternoon. See you soon.